So I'm going to start this evening with a ratio, 2d40. This is a fun little pop science fact that you've probably run across sometime in your life. But it goes like this. Bear with me. Take your hand, put your hand out in front of you, and check out your 2d and 40. So that's your pointer finger and your ring finger. And you'll probably find, it's very likely, you'll find that if you are a man, your ring finger is going to be a little bit longer than your pointer finger. And if you're a woman, it's more likely that they're going to be about even, or your pointer finger may be even a little bit longer. This is not always true, as the what at the front shows, but it's frequently true. And this is what's called sometimes a epigenetic biomarker. And that's because it's an indicator of the hormones that we were introduced to in utero. Specifically, the 2d40 ratio is an indicator of how much testosterone you were exposed to when you were gestating. And it's associated with a lot of different interesting things. We found that the 2d40 ratio is related to sexual orientation. Women who have longer ring fingers are more likely to be lesbian or bisexual. People with different 2d40 ratios have different childhood playtime behaviors, different preferences, different career paths. Women with longer ring fingers are more likely to be found in stereotypically male-dominated disciplines like engineering or management or law. It's related to the likelihood of getting breast cancer, a whole bunch of other different things. So by looking at your hand, you may have learned something fun about yourself. You might have even peeked at the person next to you and learned something fun about them. But we usually think about something like the 2d40 ratio as a pretty private thing, right? You can't just go around measuring other people's hands, right? This is Christine Duheim. I've never met her before, but she's, I think, going to be a presenter later tonight. But I did find this picture of her on the internet. And I zoomed in on her hand. And I found that you can actually see that she has a pretty long ring finger. This is a little bit atypical for a woman's hand. And it tells us something really personal about Christine Duheim, who, again, I have never met, which is what hormones she was likely exposed to when she was gestating. Here's another picture of her hand that I found on the internet. This one's not quite as clear, but you can again see that relatively long ring finger. There's another picture of her hand. And so, okay, this is one example, but you're not just going to find lots of pictures of people's hands up in front of their face on the internet, are you? Well, there's our host for tonight, Nikolas Badminton, sticking his hand up in front of his face on the internet. You actually see this is another slightly atypical hand. You can see he has a little bit of a short ring finger for a man's hand. There's his hand again. There's another picture of his hand, again zoomed in on. Again, you can see there's that relatively long pointer finger, relatively short ring finger there. And the 2d40 ratio is not the only epigenetic biomarker that's written across our bodies. We also have the direction of our hair whorls. Here's a picture of the direction of Nikolas's hair whorls that I found on the internet. And another one is facial symmetry. Can we look at facial symmetry from pictures we find on the internet? You bet we can. So you're probably thinking at this point, wow, this guy's really creepy. Yes, it's going to get worse. So if this is at all, if this feeling of creepiness is at all familiar, it's probably because of this study. So this exploded onto the internet in early September of this year. This is a study out of Stanford University by two researchers, Wang-Yi Lun and Mikhail Krasinski. And the study that they did here is they trained a machine learning algorithm on 30,000 profiles from a dating website. And they taught this machine learning algorithm to determine the difference between straight and gay faces. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about this study, and I'm not going to go into it because I could spend a very long time on it. But what they claim to have found is the ability to tell, certainly not perfectly, but considerably better than humans can and considerably better than random, whether or not somebody is straight or gay from the structure of their face. And there have been some criticisms of this paper. There have been a lot of commentary about its limitations. But I want to focus on some of the what I think are actually really unreasonable criticisms that have come out. For one thing, a lot of people right away said that this was not a credible paper, that it was not peer-reviewed. It was peer-reviewed. It was clearly peer-reviewed. It was published in a very reputable journal. A lot of people immediately called this paper racist because it was focused on only white faces. This is a bit of an odd thing to say, because if you think about this for a moment, if this is true of white faces, if this result is valid for white faces, it would be exceptionally unusual if it were not true for other faces. The researchers chose to focus on white faces to reduce the amount of noise in their data set. But as one scientist I talked to summed up this objection, this is a terrible, unethical thing to do, and I don't understand why you didn't also do it to brown people. But I think the reason why these really unreasonable objections came up to this paper was because of a final objection. And this is one that came out in a reaction from GLAAD, which is an American LGBT activist group. And GLAAD's reaction to this paper was just, no, this cannot be, it is impossible, there is no way you could ever determine somebody's sexual orientation from their face, we refuse to believe it. So I'm going to talk about how I came to this subject. I'm a journalist. I write for an LGBT newspaper called Extra in Canada. I write about health and science. And I've studied in the past, I've written in the past about LGBT populations, why they're the size they are, whether or not they will continue to grow. And in the process of writing about that, I've written a lot about how LGBT people and how straight people come to be. And I've interviewed a lot of the scientists who study this. And in a nutshell, we know that socialization, that how we are raised, does not explain very much about our sexual orientation. It can explain how we choose to identify, but it does not explain very much about what we want and what we do. We also know that our genes don't explain very much about our sexual orientation. We think that our genes maybe explain about 30% of the difference between gay and straight people. And so that leaves epigenetics. We often think about genes as little pieces of information that determine who we are, but maybe a better way to think about genes is as machines. And these machines have certain inputs and they have certain outputs, but they also have different settings. And these different settings determine what the inputs and outputs are. And these settings are determined for us during gestation, in utero, by the hormones that we're exposed to. And it's worth stressing, we do not know how this system works very well. It's very hard to get good data on this. It's the only way that we can really get data is through amniocentesis, which isn't done very often. So we don't understand how this process works. But we know that there is some process through which hormones cause this cascade of epigenetic effects that end up determining all sorts of things, including sexual orientation, quite possibly gender identity, and of course, things like finger length. So when I first saw the Wang and Kaczynski study, I was not surprised, which does not mean I think the study is necessarily valid. Wang and Kaczynski have said themselves that they don't know if it is valid, but I think it is, we should not see this study and say, this could not possibly be. I think we should see this study and say, if this isn't being done this time, it will probably be done in the future. Oh, not quite there yet. Haha. So, we'll get to the monkey soon. So, what are the possible consequences of this? Well, the really obvious one is, yeah, a repressive regime could get hold of an algorithm like this and use it to ferret out people that they thought might be gay. And this has been the objection and the worry that's come up a lot in response to this paper. But I actually don't think that it's the most likely problem. I think the most likely problem is this. When I first brought up Christine Duheim at the beginning of this talk, and I talked about the 2D/4D ratio, there's probably some little part in some of all of our minds that went, oh yeah, okay, Christine Duheim, I maybe know that she's a lawyer, she's in a male-dominated field, she has a long ring finger, that makes sense. There's this little tendency in our brains to come up with simplistic solutions to things like this on an individual basis. There's a little psychic Malcolm Gladwell that just wants to explain everything in a really simplistic, satisfying way. But I actually don't think that that's what's going on here. We tend to reach for this idea that, oh well, women with long ring fingers must be better at being lawyers. But actually, we've done a lot of research on people's abilities and their 2D/4D ratio, and we found nothing. I think it's much more likely that what's happening is that people, women with long ring fingers, are displaying gendered behaviors that we stereotypically associate with people who should be better lawyers. So these epigenetic effects are not changing whether somebody is a good lawyer. They're just giving us ways to more effectively discriminate based on our sexist assumptions of what a good lawyer should be like. And so you put this kind of algorithm in the hands of, say, a law firm, they might well be able to determine which candidates are likely to become more effective lawyers. But that's not necessarily because they're actually going to be more effective lawyers. It's much more likely because these kinds of algorithms are going to allow us to reinforce the sexist standards of behavior that we already assume. So that's what my first concern that comes out of this, which I'm going to call epigenetic sexism. But there's another one. And now we come to the monkeys. This is a Rhesus monkey. And it's performing a behavior which is called the adult two-hand clasp mount, which I think sounds like gymnastics. But this is a mating behavior that male Rhesus monkeys usually perform on females. And since the 1950s, scientists have been injecting Rhesus monkeys with hormones and hormone blockers during pregnancy, and then watching whether or not they perform behaviors like this one. And what they found is that by manipulating hormones in the womb, they can actually control all sorts of things about these monkeys' behavior, from their gendered play behaviors to their mating behaviors, whether or not they're doing mounts like this one, to who they're mounting, whether the female monkeys are mounting males or mounting females, or their males are mounting males or females. But we're not going to do this to humans, right? Wrong. This is a drug called Dexamethasone. This drug is used, already experimentally used to treat mothers whose babies have a syndrome called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And this is a syndrome that causes the babies to become what's called, in medicine they say it's virilization, which means that they're having this testosterone effect, which can cause ambiguous genitalia and all these other epigenetic effects associated with testosterone in utero. And in experiments already, doctors are using this drug to suppress those testosterone effects in babies that are affected by CAH. Now what's worrying about this is that there is no medical reason for this. The drug does not cure CAH, and the things that it changes are in no way medically damaging. The reasons why mothers are taking these is because they do not want their children to be abnormal in their gender or in their epigenetic expression. And as we get better at understanding the epigenetics that are forming our sexual and gendered natures, we're going to get better at making these interventions to change those things. And if you're somebody like me who values gender and sexual diversity in the world, this can be really troubling. So what do we do with this? Well, we can be like GLAD, and we can stick our fingers in our ears and say, la, 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 this is impossible. gender and sexuality live inside a black box that we can never touch. It's not happening. We refuse to believe it. But I don't think that's a good idea. I think that if we don't develop a sophisticated and complete and nuanced and informed understanding of how these systems work, then there are going to be companies and institutions who are going to do it for us. And they probably won't do us the favor of letting us know when they do. Thank you.